Satisfy your need for happiness through your own curiosity with the Ranveer Show. How do the Republicans look at Obama's tenure and how do the Democrats look at it?
I mean, Republicans are just negative on everything Obama related and everything Democrat related at this point.
They think he wrecked the country a little bit.
Yeah, well, because the thing is, in his second term, a lot of people believe that in 2012, Obama didn't have a strong economic record to run on yet. And arguably, frankly, the entire economy of the U.S. is fake because of all the money printing, but I'll come back to that point. So in 2012, the campaign was run not on economics, but on race and gender and this kind of stuff. And so essentially a bunch of Democrat partisans were fired up with rhetoric about how the country was racist and sexist and, so on and so forth. And so wokeness exploded. And you can see this, for example.
It made its way to urban societies all over the world as well.
Oh my God. Yeah. So look at this. See, for example, here, word signifying prejudice, right? Basically flat. And then right in 2012, whoop, they went vertical like this.
Okay. What would be a word representing prejudice?
Racism, racist, sexist, homophobic, all this kind of stuff, right?
People getting offended easily about things they were not offended about 10 years prior.
Correct. Exactly. Okay. Right. And my thesis on why this happened is because of something that most people don't think about, which is technology is upstream. It's the hidden actor behind a lot of this stuff. Okay. Because massive technological shifts have been happening. And what happened in the late 2000s is, this is a blurry, we'll do a better version of it in the thing. What happened in the late 2000s, this was US media newspaper advertising revenue, okay? 67 billion at the top there, right? Then what happened was, after the financial crisis, it just crashed all the way down to 16 billion. Imagine coming from this to this in about 10 years.
What happened to all that money?
It went to Google and Facebook.
Okay.
So the internet wasn't even, to understand what the internet was in the US, it was just considered, first computers in the 80s, and then there was internet stuff in the 90s. But after the dot-com bubble in the year 2000, the mainstream US wrote off the internet for basically the 2000s. When I was in my 20s in the 2000s, it was about Iraq and the war on terror, but the internet was sort of bubbling below the surface. And Google was scaling and so on. But even by the year 2008, technology was not considered. This is very important to understand how recent this entire period is. By the year 2008, technology was not considered a source of power in the US. There was an article from that time that was listing the power centers of the US. And they listed Wall Street and the Pentagon and Madison Avenue and Hollywood and so on and so forth. It did not list Silicon Valley. In 2008, 2009, Silicon Valley was still thought of as, it's like you buy a toaster, you buy a computer, and, you might have a nice toaster, you might have a nice car, but you don't think of that as where power is situated.
Because
right?
It didn't affect votes back then.
It didn't affect votes back then. And also, people just weren't online that much, right? But what happened after the year 2008, a lot of things went into turbo. First, the iPhone came out in 2007 and went vertical, then smartphones went. Second, Facebook really hit escape velocity and in 2007 rose to hundreds of millions of users. Third, because of the financial crash, all kinds of people were looking to tighten their belts and get more efficient advertising dollars. So tens of billions of dollars in classifieds and advertising revenue went over to tech. What this did is it destroyed the livelihoods of a good chunk of people on the East Coast seaboard. They had been used to having expense accounts and writing 10 articles a year and traveling and so on and so forth. It was a really fun life, right? And now suddenly they're laid off or their paper is bankrupt. All these local papers went bust. And who's doing well? The tech guys, right? Now the thing is, tech was considered from 2008 up until 2012, tech was just considered another wing of the Democrat Party. Like, if, for example, the very last bit of this was November 2012, right? When technology and internet companies helped Obama get reelected, right? When the nerds go marching in, how a dream team of engineers from Facebook, Twitter, and Google built the software that drove Barack Obama's reelection, okay? So as late as November 2012, tech was considered just part of the Democrat Party and good because free speech, all that kind of stuff, it was considered something that was just helping the blue team. But after the election, all of these journalists who had just been bankrupted, because this happened real fast, right? This happened over basically 4 years, right? All these journalists were like, you know what? Let's reassess our relationship with these tech guys now that the election is over. And we've got 4 years. We're going to settle some scores with the tech guys. So that's when the knives came out. And so, for example, in 2012, Gizmodo would write articles like, there's no such thing as a programmer.
What is that?
Meaning there's no such thing as like a tech bro. Okay. Like that's to say, you can't attack tech guys for being too masculine or being too chauvinistic. That doesn't exist. That's just ludicrous, et cetera, right?
Is this a response to the feminism wave rising?
Some of it was starting in 2012 under Obama's re-election campaign, right?
You know, all this matters to the rest of the world as well because American culture affects world culture.
Absolutely. And I'm going to show you that, right? So by 2013, just a year later, would you look at all these rich people and they started going after tech guys as rich, right? They started attacking them like politicians because they wanted to settle a score. And the other thing that happened was the New York Times company, and they're a company, by the way, they're not a non-profit, they're owned by a family called Oxelsbergers, right? You want to, actually, here's a question, okay? Just close your eyes. Can you visualize Mark Zuckerberg's face?
Yeah.
Okay. You know what he looks like? He's CEO of Facebook, founder of Facebook. You know, love him or hate him, he's out there taking the hit. Son of a dentist, became, you know, a billionaire and so on. Okay. Now, who owns the New York Times? Don't know, right? So this is a man, I'll show you who he is in a second, but this is a man who's surrounded by 1,000 journalists at all times. You've never read an article on him. You don't even know what his face is. You don't know his name. You probably hadn't even thought about that person as a person before, despite the fact that the New York Times is certainly as powerful an entity in some ways as Facebook or what have you, right? So here's why. It's this guy, and basically the New York Times company is just passed down from father to son. It's passed down 5 generations like this. Now, the reason this is hilarious and important is for a decade, as I'll show you, all of the New York Times journalists, all these people attacked largely Indian, Chinese, Korean, largely Asian tech populations as being white, male, privileged, blah, 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 when they were actually the privileged white males. Okay? So they were misrepresenting the reality of the situation, which looks like this. But for example, if you look at this graph, I'm not saying, I don't believe white is an insult, but tech journalists do. And if you look, the tech companies are actually significantly more non-white than the tech journalists are, right? Point is, though, that essentially all of this stuff, if you look at the graphs, all of the stuff on wokeism, right? This is like a key thing. So this is New York Times word usage frequency, 1970 to 2018, right? You see how certain things like mansplaining, toxic masculinity, male, they'll just go vertical like this. Okay, there's a comparison over here where something like Amazon or China, that's like a more organic trend. Right? This is driven by editorial judgment.
Wow.
Okay, so they just started dumping certain words into the new, basically it's literally like putting it in the water supply. They're putting it in the news feed, right? Why? Why are they putting these words in the news feed? Well, they're shocking, polarizing, agitating words that get them traffic. And why do they need traffic? Because if you look at their stock price, they had gotten crushed up to here, and they started putting these extremely inflammatory words in there, and their traffic started to come back up. And the big thing for them was in 2016, when Trump got elected, there was something called the Trump bump, and their stock price zoomed as they defended democracy against the next Hitler.
Holy shit.
Okay, so once you see this whole thing is actually a reality TV show, okay, where the New York Times is like upstream of all of this stuff, and this guy who owns the New York Times needed to make money, and so he decided to change the narrative, to change the script, because they're like the chief screenwriters of the whole thing. This is the thing that people don't get is Out of 1 million things that you can put on the front page, there's 8 billion people in the world. There's so many different things you can put on the front page, so many adjectives you can pick. Just think about your own feed and how you think about, who you have as all this stuff, right? There's obviously a lot of editorial judgment that goes into that. And that judgment, even that makes the news, right? The words that you append to that, which news articles you select, you can tell a completely different story by picking 10 of these versus 10 of these, right? You can have a totally different worldview, right? And so once you understand this aspect of it, that basically because tech had disrupted them, because it had taken away their money, they were desperate for money. And how did they make money? By essentially going to yellow journalism.
What does that mean?
Yellow journalism means non-neutral journalism, slander, libel, demagoguery, and so on and so forth.
Because everybody loves a fight.
Yeah, and the same reason Obama needed power. So Obama needed power, the New York Times needed money, and that's how you get wokeness. And you can see it go. It's not an organic thing. You can see from these graphs, the New York Times word usage frequency, they'll give all these graphs as references. You can see it just go vertical like that. This is not something that's an organic phenomenon, right? Now, you know what's funny? Once they regained control in 2020.
When Biden got elected.
Once Biden got elected, they stopped saying Black Lives Matter, et cetera, because they didn't need to cause the riots anymore. Now they're back in control, right? See, I have a decent intuition on some of these things. And I was like, my senses has dropped off a bit. And so look at that. Right after 2020, boom, guess what? Racism solved.
They're not using these words in the articles.
Exactly, right? Because they don't want to cause trouble. Now they're back in power, right? So like the level of cynicism here is on another level, like literally causing billions of dollars in riots and having people all fight each other just to boost their stock price for a few $1 million or to win an election, right? It is demagoguery. Think about sugar, okay? If people are just systematically adding sugar to every single meal, you're going to get more inflammation. You're going to gain weight, right? It's hard to avoid it. It's in everything, right? And you as a human being can only avoid these things so much. Eventually you're going to have a cookie at a friend's house, or you'll have some, like soup and it'll have sugar in it and so on and so forth. It's like if it's dumped into the water supply, it's hard to avoid it. And it's certainly hard for your friends to avoid it. So what they did is they dumped all these words into the water supply, into the media diet, and enraged people on purpose.
So this is a graph of the New York Times?
Yes.
Is there like a reverse graph of Fox News?
Interesting question. Fox reacts rather than acts. That is to say, the left acts and the right reacts.
Really?
Yeah. It's like,
I'd say this about both sides, and I have friends from both sides in America.
Right. But basically, like, for example, here, the left acts and goes left, and then the right reacts.
Gotcha.
Because the right is usually okay with the status quo, and left wants to change the world. So what I just did is I had some graphs that bring us to the present day. Just to recap, we're seeing a 70-year trend of social and political separation. We saw basically a 1, 2, 3, 4 cascade of events where technology rose, it bankrupted mainstream media, they got desperate and they needed money. Similarly, Obama in 2012 didn't have a great economic case, so he needed power. Together, basically, they just filled the airwaves with wokeness, which is a totally inorganic phenomenon. It was manufactured at that time. And that caused massive negative energy. And this, in turn, brought us to the rise of Trump, starting in 2015.
If you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out these curated playlists that we've made especially for you related to the subject that was spoken about in this clip.